did God bother to create, knowing how messed up creation would get?
Yeah, it's a great question. On the one hand, we don't know the answer to that because it's hard to know always the mind of God. There's only so many things that you have general revelation, which is creation. You have special revelation, which is the Bible. And there's also only so many things the Bible pulls the veil back on and says, here's what the motivation for God was. And so sometimes, like, even if you look at the question of evil, it's oftentimes we're philosophizing about where evil came from. But what's interesting about the Bible is it never tries to answer the question of where evil came from. For instance, Job, which is like the great book about the question of evil from the beginning to the end, you never get like the answer. Where did evil, where was its origin? You get, hey, look, Job, you're not actually smart enough to figure all this out, which is what the ancient philosophers said about evil and suffering. You read like pagan, non-Christian, non-religious, the philosophers at the time, 2,000 years ago, they would look at the pain and suffering, which they saw more of than probably we do in some sense, because the world was a pretty rough place. And they didn't say, ergo, God doesn't exist. They said, ergo, I don't have the brain capacity to figure out why the gods would allow all the things that are happening. Post-Enlightenment, we think reason is the main thing, so we think we should be able to figure it out. The reality is there's things God does that we don't necessarily understand. Alvin Plantinga philosophically talks about this as the no-see-em problem, where if you go into a tent and there's these bugs called no-see-ems. They're so small you don't see them. If you go into a tent and you open up the tent and you're looking for a Saint Bernard dog, and you go, you don't see it, you go, there's no dog here. But you can't do that if you open up the tent and you go, there's no see-ems in here, because you can't see them. In the same way, Plantinga says, why would we say, well, because we see evil, God doesn't exist? It's like maybe things happen that we can't necessarily always understand. We don't see them, but we can't deduce, ergo, God doesn't exist. And so we don't know the reason or the rationale behind why God did everything they did. I think part of why if we believe the Bible, that the cross of Jesus Christ, God himself, the second person of the Trinity, becoming a human being and dying on a cross and rising from death is the greatest moment of glory the universe has ever seen, then sin serves that purpose in the end. And so this is why the Bible says, whatever happens, God can take it and use it for a good. So whether that's Joseph gets chucked down the well, by his brothers and left for dead, and he ends up rising to power. This is the Genesis story in Egypt, and becoming like the second guy in command, so that years later when his brothers are dying of a famine, they come to him and he actually feeds them, because what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And so there's a sense in which God is doing an amazing thing throughout the Bible. The Bible doesn't stop and go, or even in our life when a bad thing happens, it's not that Christianity says, here's why every single time, but it certainly says we know that God cares. The answer is not that God doesn't care about the pain and suffering in the world. He does care. We know he does, because he came in the person of Jesus and actually dealt with it. Why he created, there was a choice he had when he was creating. He knew the risk that people would, the serpent in the garden, humankind taking the fruit. Hey, you're going to know good and evil. You're going to be like God, or don't do it and listen to God and obey. What's beautiful about that picture, as I heard one theologian talk about, a lot of people say, well, if he knew that Adam and Eve, and this is similar to the question, were going to sin, why did he create the tree? Why not just not create the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of the option? And what the one writer said is, because if you have the tree and humankind never eats of the fruit, what you have in that moment is you have obedience to God without sin. See, right now, you and I can be obedient to God in the sense of there's sin, and now I'm going to be obedient to God and not. But if you have the option of sin and you don't have people take it, you still have the beautiful reality of obedience, but you don't have sin in the world, because sin hasn't entered in through the original sin, the fall of mankind. So anyways, all that to say, God knew there was this cost-benefit ratio. He's sketched it out and said it's worth the risk. He created humankind with free will, knowing that that's where love comes from. If he created robots, that's not love. There was free will, and as Dallas Willard talks about, if you give humankind free will, you're going to get a similar world to the one we actually have, which is a lot of painful things that actually take place that God is overseeing sovereignly.
Can you talk to us just a bit about, the question is messed up, like how messed up creation would get, but then you think about like the Noah story, like how he just wiped out the whole earth, and
Right.
then why doesn't he do that again?
Right. Well, let me flip it, because I agree the world's messed up, it's broken, and God has done something about it in Jesus. But there's also a different question that philosophers ask, which is forget the problem of evil for a second, or the problem of things brokenness. What about the problem of good? Meaning, why is, we don't know whether God is holding back 99.9% of the evil that could be taking place right now in the world. What about the problem of how good life is? Like, we're breathing air, we're drinking coffee, we have love in our life, we recognize beauty, we have all these, like, life could be way worse. Why isn't it worse? So that's where we kind of got to stop ourselves a little bit and say, let's not assume this or assume that.